Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth annual lecture of the Jan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. I'm Jacob Levy from Political Science and director of the Lin Center. The Lin Center provides a home at McGill for humanistic, historical, and normative social science and social inquiry. A place where the study of the ideas and ideals about society that motivate political action, the built environment and architecture within which ideas about society take their physical and engineered form, the history of those ideas, and the historical transformations in social orders that result across historical eras and around the world can all be studied together. Most of the Lin Center's activity is clustered into 5 research groups on constitutional studies, global justice, historical transformations, global antiquities, and democracy, space, and technology. And when you see those names advertising events around campus, understand that those are parts of the Lin Center's activity. The last event in that combination of activities will take place next week when Samuel Moyn, who is a professor of law and history at Yale University, will give a lecture next Friday called Humane, the New Face of War. The talk will be sponsored by 3 of those research groups together. The Lin Center was established 4 years ago by a gift from Dr. Jan P. Lin, PhD in engineering, class of 1992, seeking to encourage and engender collaborations across disciplinary boundaries, including across deep disciplinary divides that separate not only the study of history from the study of ideas, not only the study of social science from humanistic modes, but also the divides that stand between the study of science and engineering and the study of humanities and liberal arts, broadly understood. And among our peer organizations across universities, the Lin Center is, I think, especially unique in its incorporation of engineering, architecture, the study of the built environment, the ways that we seek to study social orders partly as physical facts, drawing on the expertise from our colleagues in the sciences and engineering. And the Lin Center spans more than 60 faculty from 4 faculties of the university and more than 10 departments of the university, chiefly arts, law, and engineering, but spreading farther than that across the university as a whole. It also encompasses programs for PhD students, postdoctoral fellows, and undergraduates and master's students. It has, I think, over the last 4 years, become a really vital initiative in McGill's efforts to break down disciplinary divides and to build collaborations across very different parts of the university to help us understand social orders and their transformations. The first 3 lectures in the annual lecture series, which is aimed at providing a capstone event, drawing together all of those disparate intellectual communities from across the university. The first 3 of those lectures have been given by Orlando Patterson, Saskia Sassen, and Timur Karan. While I can't yet identify next year's speaker, I am now in a position to publicly announce that 2 years from now, corresponding with the bicentennial of McGill University, the lecture will be given by Bruno Latour. Today, we are delighted and honored to be hearing from Elizabeth Anderson. Elizabeth Anderson is one of the premier political philosophers in the world of her generation, and she's someone who has always been, I think, ahead of her time and someone who has been consistently changing the boundaries of debate in political philosophy and neighboring areas of the social sciences. And like everyone we try to bring in for this event, she's someone who has easily and often crossed disciplinary boundaries and modes of inquiry. In 1993, at arguably the peak of the influence of economics across the study of human societies, at a moment when political science and philosophy and law were all in their ways increasingly in the orbit of economic modes of inquiry, and not coincidentally at a moment of post-Cold War triumphalism for liberal economic modes of thinking. Elizabeth Anderson published Value in Ethics and Economics, a profound challenge to economics as being the primary and dominant mode of thinking about human values and human valuation. I might add some 20 to 25 years before the post-2008 spate of very famous books that would echo that thesis. In 1999, she published an article that is almost certainly the most influential single article in political philosophy in my adult life. What is the point of equality? After some decades in which the study of equality in political philosophy had come under the influence of increasingly abstract, hypothetical, thought experimental questions about precisely what it is we seek to equalize, precisely how it is we seek to make everyone face precisely the same something or other. Professor Anderson introduced a note of very significant social science-informed realism into those philosophical debates, arguing that the point of egalitarianism as a moral concern was the prevention of unjust power relations and domination. Something that comes to seem obvious in retrospect, but came, I think, as something of a thunderbolt to a literature that had become very entrenched in highly abstract and stylized modes of thinking about equality. In 2010, 3 years, I think, before we could say that the American liberal left, in its white dominant mode, put racial justice anywhere near the center of its normative attention. 3 years before that, Professor Anderson wrote a book that drew political science, sociology, and history deeply into the study of how to think about norms and ideals in American political life, The Imperative of Integration, a copy of which we will give away toward the end of the event to a student who registered. And just over a year ago, she published an important new book for which she was recently profiled in the New Yorker, called Private Government. Elizabeth Anderson is, deep breath, John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies, Arthur P. Thurmau Professor, and John Rawls Collegiate Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. She is a past president of the American Philosophical Association, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a former Guggenheim Fellow. Her books and publications have been widely and deservedly honored, and it is our honor to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Anderson.
It's a tremendous honor for me to have the privilege to address you all. Just wonderful to be here at the Jan Pilon Center. Thank you very much, Jacob, for your lovely introduction. Today, I am going to be giving historical context to where we are today, which I hope will help us gain some understanding of our current predicaments. Here we can see a very profound development that started in around 1972 or 3. In the great post-war era, productivity and wages were growing at exactly the same rate, and that is a sign of what we might call equitable growth. Workers were sharing equally in economic growth and growing productivity with the owners of capital. But starting around 1972 or 1973, we see a gigantic divergence with hourly compensation of workers stagnating more or less, even as productivity continues to grow. The result of this has been a loss of the labor share of income. This is true not only in the United States, which the previous slide illustrated, but this is in all of the advanced economies. You can see that the labor share of income has been declining and the capital share of income, therefore, has been increasing. So what is the cause of these events? I attribute this cause to a large number of deliberate policy changes whose point precisely was to shift the division of income from labor to capital. I've just listed a few of them here. We see a worldwide increase in protections of intellectual property, that is, monopoly, a decline of antitrust enforcement. This is, again, not just in the United States, but in the EU as well. Declining enforcement of laws protecting labor, particularly in the United States. Dramatic cuts in tax rates on capital. Sweden, the great social democracy, abolished the inheritance tax. Even the United States hasn't gotten that far. Declining corporate income taxes, declining taxes on capital gains and dividends. An increase in the precariat, the number of workers who have unstable access to employment, and even if they're employed, unstable hours, sharply varying income from week to week, and an inability to plan for the future. The characteristic public policy response to the growth of the precariat has been to tighten up standards for receipt of welfare and a move to workfare. This is true, of course, in the United States, but also in Germany under the Hartz reforms. We also see worldwide financial deregulation leading to the financialization of the economy and an increasing share of profits that are taken by banks and other financial entities. We saw in the 2008 financial crisis that the United States bailed out the banks, but not the debtors. We see tougher bankruptcy laws that were passed under the Bush administration in the United States, and an extraordinarily punitive regime imposed on Greece in the Eurozone for getting into a debt that it couldn't repay. We see the growth of worldwide trade deals that have largely made capital more mobile than labor, and consequently given capital more bargaining power, and that's also contributed to the declining share of labor in income. And finally, but not, there's many more causes. These are just some of the big ones. A worldwide shift towards the privatization of public services on the claim that private for-profit entities can deliver these services better than the state. We also see a bunch of ideological justifications that have been offered for this dramatic shift of policy. It goes by several names, sometimes libertarianism or neoliberalism. Advocates of these views have often claimed to be restoring the classical liberal tradition that originated with figures such as Adam Smith and John Locke. And we see a certain rhetoric emerging from this classical liberal revival. And these are all familiar normative concepts that we all use all the time: free markets, property rights, freedom of contract, efficiency, incentives, the idea of shareholder capitalism, the idea that shareholders should get first dibs on the revenues of a firm. All of these ideas have been swirling around since the 1970s to justify policies that shift income from labor to capital. I think there's a big thing that is missing in this narrative of classical liberalism. What has been unacknowledged is a certain conception of the work ethic that has been strongly driving domestic policies in the rich democratic capitalist countries of the world. And that is going to be my subject today, how to understand the work ethic and coming to an understanding of the impact of the work ethic on our own consciousness, which is, I think, often unacknowledged. So this is going to be my argument, that the division between neoliberal or conservative or self-labeled classical liberal and progressive or social democratic views reflect opposing secularized versions of the Protestant work ethic. The work ethic deeply informs both progressive and social democratic ideas and neoliberal or conservative ideas about domestic economic policy. Secondly, I will argue that classical liberals, and here the leading figures would be Locke, Smith, Mill, and on the American side, Tom Paine, who should never be ignored, largely develop a progressive tradition of thinking about the work ethic. And hence, when neoliberals and conservatives claim to be restoring the classical liberal tradition, I think they're just wrong about that. Instead, the people that they are restoring are Bentham and Malthus and like-minded figures who developed the neoliberal and conservative tradition. And what's important about that tradition is it reverses the original priority of workers over passive capital owners that I think lay at the heart of the Protestant work ethic and that was developed in the progressive social democratic tradition. So what I'm going to offer to you today is a romp through almost 300 years of intellectual and political history. So, you know, buckle your seatbelts. Oh, yes, and my final conclusion is going to be that the conservative tradition contains a class contradiction in that it applies its harsh principles exclusively to workers and not to passive capital owners. So I think that conservative tradition, unlike the progressive tradition, contains some deep contradictions in it. Okay, so who invented the work ethic? Well, we can actually find, I think its greatest exponent is the Puritan preacher, Richard Baxter, who preached in Kidderminster, England. He was identified by Max Weber in the famous Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism as a leading thinker of the Protestant work ethic, although Weber also pointed out that there were parallel figures on the continent of Europe who spread this ideology. But Baxter is just really a wonderful writer, unbelievably prolific. Weber credits Baxter with such powerful preaching that he converted Kidderminster from a place that was absolutely debauched to a bunch of Puritans who were so hardworking that they turned the town into a powerhouse in the weaving industry. So imagine preaching so inspiring that you could actually inspire your parishioners to go out and work really hard. That's pretty impressive. He was also amazingly prolific. He wrote 151 books. I would say that's pretty impressive. He was an amazingly popular theologian. Even though he was writing in the mid-17th century, I've actually been working from editions that were published 200 years later, so he was still being read in popular editions 2 centuries later. And he is, I think, a key theologian, perhaps the central theologian of the work ethic. So let's step back to the mid-17th century and think about what the work ethic was originally about. We can open the pages of Baxter's wonderful work, Saints' Everlasting Rest, which was published in 1650. In this work, Baxter encapsulates the following core anxiety that was driving Puritans in the 17th century. How can one attain assurance of one's salvation? If you can attain assurance of salvation, then you can attain assurance of the saint's rest. A saint, of course, is just someone who is known to be saved. And with all of this anxiety, what you most desire is some rest. And that's what the saints get in heaven. The Puritans were good behaviorists. They didn't think that introspection could gain accurate insight into what one truly believes and feels. So on Puritan doctrine, those who have faith are saved, but you can't really know from introspection whether you have faith. And the reason for this is wishful thinking. Everyone is so desperate to be saved that they convince themselves that they have faith, but that introspection cannot be trusted because of the force of self-deception. The only way to tell whether one truly has faith, as Baxter says, grace is never apparent and sensible to the soul, but while it is in action. The only way to tell is to observe your own action, not to introspect in one's head. It's one's practical action in the world that is the sole reliable evidence that one really has faith. And what is the relevant action? It isn't prayer or contemplation of God or anything like that. It is practical action in the world. As Baxter says, give diligence to make your calling and election sure. That is, work hard. That's how you know that you have faith and therefore are saved. Hence, Baxter told his parishioners that constant disciplined labor is the only sure sign of faith and hence the only sure sign of salvation. So what follows from this theological doctrine? Well, these are the principal components of the work ethic. Firstly, that everyone should seek a calling. That is, one conceives of a systematic occupation to which one can dedicate one's productive life. And one conceives of that occupation as something that God has called one to perform. Secondly, one must never waste time. Any idleness is a sign of sloth and a lack of faith. One of the things that Baxter does in his 5-volume Christian directory, much of this work is, it's a comprehensive work of Christian ethics, directing people in a practical way as to their duties. A lot of this work is in question and answer form. So one of the great questions he asks is the following. Question, if one is rich enough to live off rents and interest, does that relieve one of the duty to work? Answer, God told Adam that he had to work by the sweat of his brow to the end of his days. And that is the same duty that all humanity has. This is a clear attack on the idle rich, the aristocrats, of his day. And indeed, he explicitly condemned the aristocrats, especially for their neglect of the education of their daughters, which led them to grow up in idleness, whiling away their days on parties, gossip, and frivolity, handing their children over to nannies and governesses and so forth to be raised while they're just lounging around in idleness. He thought this was terrible, that the hard work of child rearing is a calling and should be honored, and that every parent should educate their daughters to take up this calling. He also argued that we must not waste any of the material goods or natural resources of the earth. God put the earth there for the use of humanity, and we need to use it for the greater glory of God and to advance the welfare of our fellows. Puritans, of course, advanced an ascetic doctrine. So one should not waste one's time indulging in worldly pleasures and vanity. These are sins. Work is a useful ascetic discipline to lead us away from temptation. Baxter also argued that it was a sin to covet what one neighbors want, what one neighbors have. But even more than that, anyone who wants more material goods than they need to do their duty is covetous and sinful. So no one should want more for themselves than is strictly necessary to do their duty. Yet, here's a funny aspect of Baxter. He also says that every man should frugally getteth and saveth as much as he can. And hence, he also thinks it's a strict duty to choose, if you have a choice between a higher paying and a lower paying calling, you must choose the higher paying one. So here we have a puzzle, because on the one hand, we're not supposed to be coveting more and more beyond what we need to do our duties. But then we're supposed to be maximizing our earnings. How do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory thoughts? Well, Baxter gave us utilitarianism and the doctrine of effective altruism to solve this seeming contradiction. Max Weber identified Baxter as the original act utilitarian, and I believe he's correct. So Baxter says in the Christian Directory that if we have a choice between obtaining two goods or creating or producing two goods, we must choose the greater, or else we sin. It's a notorious fact about act utilitarianism in its orthodox form that supererogation is impossible. That is, that we always have a strict duty to choose the greater good. And hence, you can never do anything beyond the call of duty. Those of you who are familiar with the articles of the Church of England know that that's simply Article 14, that there is no such thing as supererogation. Baxter is following the orthodoxy of his own church in this regard. We also have a duty of universal charity. So what is it to choose the greater good? Well, he says specifically, the good of many is to be preferred before the good of a few. We practically have here the classic utilitarian formula that we ought to promote the greatest good of the greatest number. And it's precisely this logic that enables Baxter to reconcile, number one, the requirement that one not be covetous or seek more than is strictly needed to do one's duty, and the requirement that one maximize one's income. The duty of effective altruism which today has been fervently advocated by the great utilitarian Peter Singer, actually comes from Baxter. A few weeks ago, I had occasion to write to Peter to inform him that he's just channeling Baxter, and Peter was delighted to learn about this ancestor. So let's think about the logic here of effective altruism. You can see Baxter almost backing his way into the doctrine. So you have a duty to maximize your income, and you have a duty not to waste any of that wealth that you've accumulated. It must be used, but you can't spend it on yourself because that would be covetous, sinful, self-indulgent, and vain. You have nothing else to spend it on but your needy brethren. Importantly, Baxter does not convert this into a theory of pure philanthropy whereby the rich just dispose of their wealth like Bill Gates according to whatever one might find interesting. He allows that the rich have a strict duty to pay their taxes because a major way in which human welfare is advanced is through public works and welfare projects that are carried out by the state. So now I'm going to move ahead a bit and show how the work ethic, an original Puritan doctrine, became secularized. This is a key part of Max Weber's story of the Protestant ethic, that an ethic that was born from basically Calvinist theological premises over time became secularized. In the Protestant ethic, Weber takes Benjamin Franklin as the epitome of the secularized work ethic. But if you read Franklin, he's not really a public policy guy. He's giving prudential advice to individuals. I'm much more interested in tracing the influence of the work ethic on people who are thinking about public policy. So what I'll do is show that the work ethic has both informed a progressive, ultimately social democratic path in public policy on the one hand, a kind of left-wing path, and a conservative path, which is basically what we know of as neoliberal or conservative policy today. So on the left-hand column, we'll be seeing the theological claims that Baxter makes, and on the right-hand column, how those claims became secularized. Baxter insists that all workers are doing God's work when they labor diligently in their calling. They are glorifying God, and hence must be honored as such. He insists that this applies even to the most menial worker. Street sweepers are doing God's work and must be honored for that reason. The secular version of this insists on the dignity of all workers, regardless of their occupation, and also on the importance of meaningful work. Work that would be worthy of one's calling. You can even see this in Marx's famous 1848 manuscripts. You could read that as saying, what would work have to look like in order to be worthy of a calling, worthy of one's dedication, and insisting that, in fact, it's part of our species being, our species essence, that we do engage in productive labor, but it has to be of the right kind. It has to be meaningful, affirming of ourselves and our fellow beings. This is completely in sync with Baxter. Secondly, Baxter insisted that workers are entitled to a frugal living wage. Remember, he has an ascetic doctrine, so workers aren't going to be rich because nobody really is going to be high on the consumption end on his ascetic view. But when this doctrine gets secularized, the rewards of hard work are pulled from the next life into this life. And hence, if you're producing a lot of good, you are entitled to share in it. So we get Adam Smith's argument that workers are entitled to high and rising wages. And of course, that was also a central demand of the labor movement in the 19th century and following, and of social democrats. Thirdly, Baxter insisted that there is a right and duty to charity. The rich have a duty to charity, and the poor have a right to it. The secularized version says that everyone has a right to social insurance to prevent them from falling into poverty in the first place. Baxter assured the diligent worker of leisure in the next life, the saint's rest. You must work relentlessly in this life, but in the next life you will get your reward as a saint and get your rest in communion with God. The secularized version pulls the reward of work from the next life into this life and says the state should assure every worker of maximum hours, limitation on the length of the working day, paid vacation, one of the great glories of European welfare state that is not recognized in the United States, parental leave and so forth, all of these exemptions from wage labor. Finally, Baxter argued that each individual is capable of internalizing the work ethic, that is, working from their own free will in a diligent way. Here was one point at which Baxter actually deviated from the Puritan orthodoxy, which supposed that only a tiny elect would be saved. Baxter was a universalist. He thought everyone potentially could be saved, that it was within their power to be saved. And the secular parallel is the idea that workers are perfectly capable of self-government. Just as Baxter was confident that each individual was capable of self-government such that they could achieve salvation, the secular version of that is that workers are perfectly capable of governing themselves at work. And so the ideal of free labor is an ideal either of individual self-employment or perhaps employment in a workers' cooperative where the workers collectively govern the enterprise. Now, there's also a conservative path to secularizing the work ethic, and that is going to be the focus of my lecture today. So there are other aspects of Baxter's doctrine that can be interpreted in a way that's quite harsh towards workers. Puritans, like Baxter, tended to believe that poverty was the result of laziness, of sloth. And hence, when they looked around, they thought that poor workers stood to the rich bourgeoisie as lazy sinners were to the hard workers. That doctrine, secularized, amounts to the idea that honor or esteem is conditional on manifesting material self-sufficiency in one's life, earning enough not to rely on another person's charity. The secularized version also manifests a kind of suspicion of the poor, that they must be undeserving. Their poverty is a sign that they're undeserving. Secondly, the conservative version of the work ethic takes very seriously the idea that every man has a strict duty to maximize his profits. And how do you do that? Well, you can do that, number one, by disciplining your workers to work really hard. And we can see the secularized version of this in shareholder capitalism. The idea that public policy should favor the owners of the firm, the shareholders, over the workers, because profits need to be maximized. On the theological version, another way to maximize profits, of course, is to suppress wages. Famously, the Puritans argued that he who does not work shall not eat. The suppression of wages, of course, leads to the working poor, and the doctrine that he who does not work shall not eat leads to a pretty harsh kind of system. A general preference for private charity or workfare, conditioning the receipt of welfare on work. Baxter's theology implied that no leisure could be unearned. You're only entitled to that leisure that you have earned. Of course, on his view, you would earn it through hard work in this life, but enjoy it in the next. In the secularized version, where we're only thinking about the goods of this world, it implies that nobody's entitled to unearned vacations, paid leave, and so forth. That's the American system. Baxter also sometimes conceived of work not only as an honorable calling that glorifies God, but also as an imposed ascetic discipline. And that leads to what I'm going to call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which I will shortly discuss. But before I get there, I just want to spend a little time thinking about the world of the classical liberals and highlight some ways in which they diverge from our contemporary imagination of what the classical liberals were about. And here I'm taking as my paradigmatic classical liberals John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Tom Paine. Well, it is known that they were anti-monopolists. I think they would have heartily supported the progressive campaign of Senator Elizabeth Warren to break up the big monopolies. They were also very skeptical of the inheritance laws that prevailed in England at the time. Adam Smith famously argued that primogeniture and entail should be abolished, and indeed he even had difficulty finding any rationale for the right to inheritance, although he conceded that as a matter of positive law, some version of inheritance could be justified. Tom Paine argued for a stringent estate tax on all property owners, which was to be used to fund a universal social insurance system, including old age pensions and disability insurance. All of the classical liberals, of course, were anti-slavery. That amounts to an assault on a certain kind of property that was recognized at the time, property in persons, and they all thought it should be dismantled. None of them had any particular problem with taxation, unlike libertarian theorists today, and they favored state regulation in favor of poor workers. So this is John Locke, a direct quote from the first treatise of government. Charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want. A title is a property right. Locke here is asserting that the right to charity has exactly equal standing as a matter of justice as the right to ownership in land or any other property right. Adam Smith famously argued that poor workers were entitled to a state-funded education, and their children were entitled to that. Classical liberals also defended the rights of workers in numerous ways. They opposed all forms of unfree labor. Here I'm thinking of Smith, Paine. Even Abraham Lincoln is a late representative of classical liberalism in the United States. Not just slavery was an object of their condemnation, but all kinds of involuntary servitude, including serfdom, peonage, indentured servitude, and famously apprenticeship. If you read The Wealth of Nations, you will see Adam Smith condemning the practice of unpaid apprenticeship. Maybe that's something we should be thinking about today when we see the proliferation of unpaid internships. I don't think Smith would have been happy with that system. Locke and Smith agreed that property rights are founded on labor, a clear expression of the work ethic. Locke and Smith took for granted the labor theory of value, and indeed that's a fundamental common sense premise of all of the classical economists. Smith famously argued for high and rising wages. He also argued that whenever a state regulation is in favor of the worker, it is always just and equitable. Tom Paine and John Stuart Mill advanced an ideal of universal self-employment, that is, the autonomy of workers. So did Lincoln, by the way. Lincoln, in his famous stump speech, 1860 stump speech for the presidency, argued that our Creator gave us one head and two hands, and by that he probably intended that this head should govern these two hands, specifically in respect to the governance of labor. Classical liberals such as Condorcet and Paine advanced programs of universal social insurance. Okay, so what happened? What I've argued so far is that the classical liberals, Locke, Smith, Mill, Paine, they're all developing a secularized version of the work ethic that has strong pro-worker dimensions. So what happened? Where did that tradition go? Well, where did the conservative tradition come from? I believe that the Industrial Revolution played a critical role in stimulating the development of the harsh conservative version of Baxter's work ethic, now secularized in the late 18th and early 19th century. And the result of the Industrial Revolution was basically an inversion of the liberal targets. So whereas the classical liberals focused most of their ire on the idle rich, the conservatives turned that around, looked at the poor, assumed they must be the idle ones, and focused their ire and hostility against the poor. So what were the basic components of this conservative, or what we call today neoliberal inversion? I think it comes from the fact that the Industrial Revolution created a new class formation. So the Puritans, many of them were craftsmen, and an interesting thing about a craftsman is that they're both a capitalist and a worker at the same time. They own their own shop. The master craftsman would own his own shop, but would also be actually engaged in manual labor, crafting various items for sale. And so one and the same person is both a laborer and a capitalist. But the Industrial Revolution destroyed the craft model of manufacturing. The craftsmen were wiped out, turned into immiserated wage workers, and the industrialists owned these gigantic factories, and no longer, they were not engaged in manual labor. And ultimately, the large factories just became owned by shareholders who are passively clipping coupons. The result of the Industrial Revolution then was a split between the capital owners, the wage workers, and then an immiserated class who might be chronically unemployed or have difficulty getting access, what we today call the precariat or the underclass. And it's that split, I think, that divides the work ethic into a progressive version advocated by the wage workers and a conservative version that articulates the class position of capital owners who invert the work ethic by favoring capital over labor based on a bunch of stigmatizing assumptions about workers as lazy and undeserving insofar as they are poor. This, of course, is inseparable from the rise of the factory system and the general rise of total institutions. Isaac Kramnik, who I think has done a wonderful job explaining the ideology behind the rise of total institutions among late 18th century bourgeois liberals, encapsulates this thought as follows. While liberals preached independence, freedom, and autonomy in polity and market, they preached order, routine, and subordination in factory, school, poorhouse, and prison. You can see exactly the same theme in Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And indeed, both of them cite Bentham's famous plan for the panopticon, his famous prison plan, as an example of this. Foucault argues that the panopticon became the model for all kinds of other institutions. The prison is idealized as an architecture that's equally suitable for housing workers, the ill, the insane, and criminals. And I think Kramnik and Foucault are right about this. And we can see this in Jeremy Bentham. Foucault only mentions Bentham's famous work on the panopticon, which was specifically about a prison, but he wrote another work which is not nearly studied enough, which I think shows the ways in which the work ethic became turned against workers. The name of the work is Pauper Management Improved by Means of the Panopticon Principle. It was first published in 1797 in an agricultural journal, where it was seemingly died in obscurity. But Bentham was so enthusiastic about his panopticon plan that he had it republished, in fact, more than once. So we can take a look at the 1812 edition. What did he propose? Well, in the late 18th and early 19th century, property owners started complaining about the burdens of taxation needed to support the poor law. So England was the great pioneer in nationalizing the responsibility of charity. Other countries depended on the church to distribute alms to the poor. But under Queen Elizabeth I, a poor law was passed that made provision for the poor a national responsibility. By the turn of the 19th century, property owners are complaining a lot about the tax burden required to support the poor. And Bentham came forth with a plan to relieve the taxpayer of this burden. This, I think, contains an original argument for the privatization or outsourcing to private for-profit companies of fundamental government services. He argued that the problem with state provision for the poor was that government officials can't run anything competently or efficiently, so they waste the taxpayers' money. Hand over these enterprises to private for-profit entrepreneurs, and they will figure out how to turn a profit. And hence, the poorhouses ought to be privatized. Bentham proposed that entrepreneurs should be free to bid for the right to have a monopoly on the poorhouses, and the highest bidder then would be awarded a monopoly and have to construct enough poorhouses to house all of England's poor. His proposal amounted to the criminalization of poverty. So the private entrepreneur running the poorhouses would be empowered to arrest any vagrant, any beggar, anyone who looked too poor to support themselves, anyone who fell short of self-sufficiency, as well as orphans, the insane, the ill, the disabled. They would all be arrested and imprisoned in a panopticon structure where they would be set to work. Bentham has an extreme principle of no waste in his proposal. Nothing shall be wasted. Bentham says, not a nod, not a wink shall be allowed to happen in the panopticon without turning it to profit. He meant this literally. In fact, he spends pages and pages and pages discussing how every last motion of the poor is to be turned to profit. So one might imagine, what about people who are so ill that they're bedridden? Oh, well, you can provide them with hand looms, which they can operate while they're dying. But what about disabled people? Consider, for instance, he didn't know the term at the time, but consider people with Parkinson's disease, they have tremors. So how could you actually, they wouldn't have the coordination to work a hand loom. How could you make use of these tremors? Well, you could assign people who have uncontrollable tremors to the nurseries where they would be able to rock the cribs of the newborn babies. He goes on and on and on, right? Nothing that the poor consume or no physical action is allowed to rest in and of itself as something that they could just enjoy for its own sake. Every last thing must be turned to profit. I take this to be a manifestation of the no waste principle that we saw originating in Baxter, that nothing shall be allowed to be wasted, but now exclusively directed to the poor. His version of the poor law is, of course, a form of workfare. No one shall eat who does not work. Of course, he did exempt babies, but that's only because they would be bound in service until their age of 21. So sure, babies, we'd have to lose some profits while the babies are growing up, but at the earliest possible occasion, the children would be put to work and have to work till the age of 21, turning profits for the poorhouse monopolist. And indeed, he predicted that adult women paupers would yield a 200% profit rate for the manager of the pauper panopticons. Adult men would yield a 300% profit rate, but the greatest profits of all would come from the employment of child labor. Profits beyond dreams, because you had bound them in service until the age of 21, and it took almost nothing to feed them. Indeed, Bentham argued that the panopticon was an excellent place for human experimentation on children, and he advocated that the panopticon owners experiment with how little food could be given to children and how cheap food could be given to them, consistent with their not dying. A perhaps more famous figure who encapsulates the harsh, conservative, and now neoliberal doctrine towards the poor is, of course, Thomas Malthus, another preacher. There's not a single element of the contemporary conservative critique of welfare that was not articulated by Thomas Malthus in his Principles of Population. I urge you to just skip over all of the predictions about overpopulation. In fact, the significance of Malthus's work lie overwhelmingly in his doctrines about welfare, and none of this really relies on predictions about population. Instead, what he urged was a strict principle of individual responsibility. And you can see this as a kind of secularized version of the idea that in Puritanism, each individual is responsible for their own salvation. Now each individual is responsible for their own survival. Malthus invented the idea of a culture of poverty, that the only thing getting the poor down was their own dysfunctional culture of laziness, promiscuity, drinking, and other vices. He argued that the provision of welfare to the poor generated perverse incentives to idleness and vice. And he stigmatized anyone receiving welfare as dependent, unworthy, and undeserving. Well, how do you make such a harsh doctrine popular? He figured that one out too. His tract was mainly addressing the middle class who resented all the taxes that were being used to support the poor. And he argued that the undeserving poor were a burden on the deserving middle class. So now with this really quick trip through the history of political economy, through the lens of the work ethic, I've argued for the following: that there's a deep conflict between the progressive or pro-worker version of the secularized work ethic and the conservative or pro-capital version of the work ethic. And that conflict, which you can see the seeds of in Baxter, gets sharpened by the Industrial Revolution because of the split between, the class split between capital workers and the underclass. The first half of the Industrial Revolution represents a triumph of the right-wing or conservative version of the work ethic. England actually debated the Poor Law. There's a famous Poor Law reform, I believe it's 1834, which officially abolished so-called outdoor relief and demanded that anyone receiving government welfare payments had to be consigned to a workhouse where they would be forced to labor. Now, in fact, this never really was realistic because nobody ever figured out a way to turn a profit off of the poorhouses. So even though the law was passed, it didn't really work as planned, but everyone recognized this powerful stigmatizing impact on the poor of the virtual criminalization of poverty. In the second half of the Industrial Revolution, you see the growth of the labor movement and nascent ideas of social democracy, and that moved the history of political economy over to the left. That social democratic labor movement version of the work ethic lasted, it was on the rise in the second half of the 19th century, came to full flourishing in the post-war era, and lasted until the mid-1970s. And then you see a dramatic neoliberal backlash and a restoration of the right-wing version of the work ethic in public policy. Malthus's arguments triumphed in the workfare reforms of 1996 that imposed work requirements on the receipt of welfare in the United States. And we see those Malthus-style arguments repeated today in several states of the United States, insisting that work requirements be attached to the receipt of health insurance, Medicaid for the poor. So in effect, we're really just back to the 19th century. The left graph shows here, we have a graph. The blue line represents the rise of output in England in the 19th century, and the pink line represents the growth of wages. And the first half of the Industrial Revolution, we can see here that wages were stagnant, even as productivity was rising. This is known as Engels' pause. It represents recognition that capital was getting a greater share of the national income in England at the time, whereas workers weren't really seeing any gains. With the rise of the labor movement in the second half of the 19th century, you could see a rise of equitable growth for a number of decades in the 19th century. There were other things, state regulations, factory acts, and so forth, that were also helping. But we can see that the graph with which I opened this talk is just recapitulating the 19th century. So we see here starting around 1972 or 73. Capital getting a rising share of income and wages stagnating. Second half of the 20th century up to today represents a kind of repeat of Engels' pause. Not surprisingly, we see similar policies, especially harsh policies concerning welfare, repeated. Now I come to the normative heart of my historical story. The neoliberal inversion of the work ethic, turned harshly against the purportedly idle poor, embodies a contradiction. And the reason for this is that in Baxter's original version, all of his arguments were targeted against, most of his arguments at any rate, were targeted against the idle rich. He had a little bit against the idle poor too, but in fact, in the progressive tradition, you see most of the arguments directed against the passive recipients of profits, interest, and rents. But in a neoliberal inversion, we forget about all this receipt of income for which one has not lifted a finger and focus exclusively on the purportedly idle poor. So we see in today's neoliberal rhetoric figures like John Tomasi who think that the critical thing about happiness is that it be earned, and hence passive receipt of welfare payments really can't contribute to happiness, he thinks. He targets this argument against the welfare state, but seemingly forgets that the exact same reasoning would also condemn the receipt of income from capital gains, interest, inherited wealth, and indeed, even the whole principle of shareholder capitalism, which is all about maximizing profits, the share of corporate income received by shareholders as opposed to workers, people who actually worked for it. The neoliberal stress on individual agency, standing up for oneself as an individual, repeatedly deployed against labor unions where workers stand collectively. They don't seem to notice that in a corporation, we see a union of shareholders who collectively own the corporation and are collectively represented by the board of directors. Where's their individual agency? The thought that each of us is responsible for the consequences of our choices has been repeatedly deployed against debtors. Your fault for getting into debt, but never against creditors for taking a foolish risk in issuing loans. Why shouldn't they pay some of the costs of a bad loan? After all, they did charge a risk premium for risky loans. That's their insurance. Why should they get bailed out when they already collected the risk premium while the debtors are left squeezed? Anti-monopoly arguments have been repeatedly deployed against labor unions. They're a little monopoly, says the complaint. But we don't see among neoliberals these same anti-monopoly thoughts being deployed against the extension of intellectual property rights, the deconstruction of antitrust law, monopsony employers is a growing issue in the United States, or other kinds of monopolies such as in high tech. Neoliberals also constantly claim that we need incentives, but by which they mean sticks for the workers and carrots for the capital owners. It seems to be a contradiction. Smith himself said, if you want workers to work harder, give them carrots. The reason why slaves don't work hard is that they're not being paid for their labor. They're not innately lazy. If you pay workers well, you will get diligent labor from them. So what are the lessons for today? Number one, I urge us to sharply distinguish the classical liberalism of the 17th and 18th century paradigmatic figures here: Locke, Smith, Paine, John Stuart Mill. We should distinguish classical liberalism, which I think was largely pro-labor, from the neoliberal and conservative reversal that we see emerging in the 19th century and recapitulated in the late 20th century. I've also argued that the reversal of classical liberal ideas embodies a bunch of contradictions. You really can't make sense of it. In the classical liberal version, the idle rich were a constant target, while some rights to passive income from capital is recognized by classical liberals. None of them think that this is a natural property right to get as much as one can by way of profit. This is a matter of positive law. It has its utilitarian uses, but on utilitarian grounds, there's also plenty of good reasons to tax that. But now I think we have to step back and ask a bigger question. Both of these great traditions of political thought are grounded in the work ethic, and that presupposes that it's even possible to construct an economy in which everyone has a job. And perhaps, I'm not entirely sure, but there is some growing evidence that automation is leading to technological unemployment. It's not clear once the self-driving car is invented what the millions and millions of truck drivers and taxi drivers are going to be able to do. Will we always be able to come up with enough jobs for everyone? Perhaps we are reaching the end of an era. The great economist John Maynard Keynes, in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, predicted that maybe we are at the end of an era. He was a little bit early in making that prediction. Maybe, though, we are headed for it now with the age of artificial intelligence. And if so, then perhaps, and I'm not saying this with any certainty at all, but perhaps we're reaching an era in which the work ethic maybe is outliving its value, in which case it seems to me the inevitable conclusion is rents for all. Thank you.
We have a little over 10 minutes for questions. I'd ask people to go to the microphone in the center aisle to ask questions, and please ask questions. I still have a microphone in my hand, and I will interrupt if I decide that you are filibustering and speech making.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. It was fascinating. What puzzles me about the work ethic is why should we work in factories, right? Why the shift from that? Because it seems to me that there's at least an alternative way of framing the work ethic coming from the Catholic Church this time. You know, in Quebec in the 19th century, as people were flocking to the factories of Massachusetts and New England in general, the Catholic Church reaction was to say, no, the real work ethic, the real way to salvation is to work on a farm, on a self-sufficient farm, with low income and have large families. So it's a work ethic, but they don't send you to the factory, they send you to the farm. So I'm just wondering if it's just the Baxter's utilitarianism that explains the kind of difference, or if it's if there's something more complicated.
Yeah. So let's keep in mind that Baxter is writing long before the Industrial Revolution. He couldn't possibly have anticipated the factory system. And so most people, in fact, were working in agriculture when he was writing, and farming is a perfectly acceptable calling on his view, as is child rearing. So there isn't even an expectation in Baxter's theology that one work for wages or for pay. Unpaid dependent care labor is an honorable calling just as much as paid labor is.
I wonder where there's a little bit of tension in Baxter between the sufficientarian frugalist idea and the utilitarian call for maximization. So if all of us are act utilitarians and we interpret that as maximizing profit, which is, that would require so there would be much more to distribute than is needed for everybody to reach enough for a frugal life.
Absolutely, you're right. But again, it's because Baxter is writing before the Industrial Revolution. He couldn't have conceived the immense increase in productivity and the ability to just produce mountains of wealth that we see in the rich countries today. So it would be the case, he would have to rethink everything given today's prosperity because we're all wallowing in luxury, right? And that would be awful from his point of view. But then like, how could you possibly justify maximizing profits? Right, I think, yeah, but he couldn't have anticipated that.
Hi, Professor. Again, thank you for a very interesting lecture. I was curious about what your thoughts were about where luck egalitarianism fits within this conflict between conservative and more progressive versions of work ethic, especially luck egalitarians who have a more equality of opportunity model and so really draw on this individual responsibility.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. I do think that the individual responsibility theme of luck egalitarianism really is channeling the work ethic here. And if we think about this in terms of the original Protestant theology, because the theological version believes that each individual is personally responsible for their own salvation, it's totally up to you whether you work hard or not. There's no recognition of structural obstacles to salvation. Because, and this is sort of characteristic of Protestantism, it's a very individualistic doctrine. You don't need institutions like the church, like the Catholic Church, to reach salvation. You don't need other people like priests to do this. You can just do it all on your own. And that individualism is really deeply embedded in secularized versions of the work ethic. So there tends to be just a complete inability to conceive of structural obstacles to, things like poverty traps, structural obstacles to self-sufficiency. Malthus just can't conceive of it. He insists in his Principles of Population that it is within the individual power of each poor person, simply by practicing virtue, to escape poverty. He says that explicitly, and that's a core part of conservative doctrine today. It's all on you. It's your personal responsibility. Don't ask anybody else for help. Because if you haven't made it, that's just a sign of your vice.
Thank you again. I have a question about Locke. I'm just wondering how, because you put it in the category with the leftist, I guess, classicist. And I just wonder, when he talks about, well, first of all, slavery, he does recognize that some forms of slavery are okay, as far as I remember, but he talks about how the work of your worker, of your employer, is like your work. He says that, you can appropriate the labor of your worker as though it's your own, because you pay the worker. And I just wonder how that fits in.
Right, okay, so what you're doing here is articulating C.B. Macpherson's reading of Locke, which I think is just completely wrong. I just think it's totally anachronistic. So getting to the slavery point, this is really, really important. It is true that Locke thinks that an individual, like murderer or something, some criminal, anyone who could justly be put to death, you could extend a kind of mercy to them in the state of nature, and instead of killing them outright, you could put them into involuntary servitude for life. Keep in mind that there's nothing in that doctrine that could conceivably justify the actual institution of chattel slavery, which was intergenerational. So it has incredibly limited scope, and there's a huge discussion about Locke's involvement in the slave trade. I could go into that, but it'd take too long. His involvement is a lot less than people assume, and there's nothing in his doctrine that could justify actual chattel slavery. Secondly, when it comes to wage labor, McPherson has just grossly exaggerated this because he's projecting the conditions of wage labor from the Industrial Revolution on to the 17th century. It's just a complete anachronism. As a model, servants in the 17th century, that was just a temporary condition. Servants were young adults, and they would be servants for a time. Think of like apprentices, journeymen. They all aspired to self-employment. That's the classic craft model. And we see this in Lincoln. Lincoln argued that no one was consigned to the condition of wage labor for life. He didn't mean that it was like absolutely prohibited, but rather that the free and just system of labor would be, as a young adult, you go out and you would work for somebody else for a time, be paid good enough wages to be able to save those so that you could go out and buy a farm of your own or get professional training or some kind of education and then be self-employed. And in that context, it seems wage labor is not such a big deal. It's not an oppression because it's just a stepping stone.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, thank you very much. It was a wonderful lecture. So my question pertains to sort of the practice of political philosophy in general. When we practice political philosophy and political theory, we're often looking at situations we see in real life, the conditions that other people live in. And I wonder, what kind of a premium should we place on theories or ideas based on whether they can actually be executed given the political circumstances? If we produce an immaculate theory of justice or of equality, but we don't think that we'll actually be able to institute it, is this what we should really be doing in our political theory work? Or should we be trying to find something that, even if it doesn't attain all the goals we'd like to see, we think it's the best option available to us? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm a strong advocate of what's known as non-ideal theory, starting from the problems that we're experiencing and then theorizing about what's causing those problems and how to get us out of them and what causal levers are available to us to improve our situation. But that doesn't rule out the presence of ideals. One can have ideals, and indeed, human beings we're full of ideals. That's what makes life meaningful. If we didn't have ideals, then what? I mean, well, you eat, you sleep. There's not much there, right? Physiological existence doesn't add up to much. The work ethic itself is an incredible ideal. I'm completely driven by it. I'm like working all the time. I'm reading Baxter and I'm thinking, wow, this is why I'm impatient and can't stand for my time to be wasted. Right? I'm like totally channeling these ideas. And I'm, of course, incredibly privileged to have an occupation that I find incredibly interesting and meaningful, and I'm helping my students and, bringing ideas for other people to hear and think about and sometimes even inspire people. So that's pretty exciting. But I also have to keep in mind that there's masses of workers who are confined to drudgery, despised on that account, left in a state of precarity or poverty. Those are the people who I think we got to be thinking about. And so I'm very much in this non-ideal mode, but it doesn't rule out the possibility that, yes, ideals are important, but we can't assume that we can nail down through a priori argument and reasoning what the correct ideals are. If we look at the history of thought, we see ideals configured and reconfigured in light of new circumstances. They're changing all the time. Nietzsche famously argued that concepts with a history cannot be defined, right? And he's thinking in particular of normative concepts. We're constantly revaluing our values. Nothing is held fixed. A priori reasoning can't hold it fixed. So my critique of ideal theory is the idea that it's not that I'm criticizing ideals. We need them. What I'm criticizing is the idea that we can use pure a priori reasoning to figure out what the correct ideals are in all possible worlds. That, I think, is a folly and a waste of time.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the last three people, ask your questions in quick succession, which will then let Professor Anderson decide which of them she wants to pull on for her last couple minutes of replies.
Thank you for the talk. You gave us a history of some of the right-wing side of the work ethic and how it plays into contemporary neoliberalism and the ideology behind it. But there's another set of thinkers that have been influential in neoliberalism, people like Hayek and theorists of spontaneous or decentered order, which seems important given the fact that you said, number one, Malthus and his ilk couldn't conceive of structural obstacles, and number two, you concluded with this idea of rents for all, which would seem to presuppose a certain kind of institutional form or backing in order to happen. So what is the relationship between the other strand of neoliberal ideological justification and the work ethic stuff that you've just spoken about today, and how do they relate?
Right, that's a really great question. Oh, yes, okay, yep.
Right. So I was really interested by your depiction of these sort of two historical trajectories. And I was wondering, in light of the conclusion of your talk, what opportunities there might be or that we might see in society for sort of, I guess, creative reconfiguration. I'm thinking particularly in light of the example of the sort of Silicon Valley ethos, which you might sort of refer to maybe as a work aesthetic. But that is to say, it puts the two trajectories together in like a genuinely novel way. That is to say, tech people, you know, they're into stoicism, gray hoodies, CrossFit, treating themselves like they're in panopticons. But it seems like I'd initially read it as like a conservative sort of culture, but it seems like it has both. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Is it coherent? Is it a genuine new alternative? Or should we just see these two historical trajectories as the limits of this idea? Thank you.
Hi, Professor. Thank you again for your talk. Someone else that had done work on the work ethic is Kathy Weeks, and she also came to a similar conclusion about sort of rents for all, proposing a system of guaranteed basic income. But one thing that she at least struggled with, at least in her conclusion, was that while it's important to achieve critical distance through that solution, she's also not quite sure it's quite the proper response, because it's, I think she called it that it's kind of like throwing cash at the problem rather than proposing an infrastructural solution. I was wondering sort of what you thought about that critique, or her self-critique in that sense. Thank you.
Yeah, so actually there are connections between these things through the universal basic income, which is also sort of a popular thing among the plutocrats of Silicon Valley. They're recognizing the automation problem. I'm not such a fan of the universal basic income. There are some social problems that can't be cracked by it. Number one, healthcare. I think that's just got to be directly provided. And number two, housing. The market just cannot supply housing all on its own to everyone. As far as automation goes, there are other things. There are some worries about, you know, endless unemployment. People do need, the vast majority of people do feel a strong drive to be useful, to have and you don't have to find your usefulness in paid labor, but a lot of people find it difficult to imagine some other way to be useful to their fellow human beings. I think this is sort of a gender problem. Men have it worse than women. I mean, it's always meaningful to be raising your kids, even if it's not paid. I do think that's an issue that we really have to rethink. But one possibility is just sharing jobs. Just everyone, like, instead of having each job being 40 hours a week, maybe just have 4 jobs at 10 hours a week. I think that could work for a lot of jobs. Getting to Hayek, Hayek's an incredibly interesting figure in the history of political thought. By the way, he was no opponent of social insurance. He saw that the German system worked pretty well, and he was okay with it. He even said this in The Road to Serfdom. But Hayek made a fundamental error. Hayek, I think, had very deep insights into the way markets can aggregate and deploy highly dispersed information to produce efficient outcomes in the allocation of resources. I actually think he's basically right about that. What is wrong about Hayek, though, is his failure to recognize, he imagined that markets are like flowers growing naturally from the soil of freedom. And I just think that's wrong. Markets are incredible pieces of elaborate social engineering. If you actually look in detail at all the regulations it takes to make a market work well, just like, start reading policy wonks on how to get utility markets, like electricity markets, to work well, and you realize, wow. Or financial markets, futures markets. There's millions and millions of rules that are needed to make these things work well. There's a wonderful book by Bernard Harcourt. I can't remember the name of it now. But the first chapter has this fabulous set piece in which he compares the super-regulated market for bread in 18th century France with the regulations that are needed for supposedly free market commodities trading, that is futures trading, I think it is, some kind of financial asset at any rate. And he shows that each of them have like millions and millions of regulations needed in order to get these things right. The only difference is that in the French pre-revolutionary bread market, the price was set as well. All that the free market does is takes this elaborate machinery and it lets the price float, but all the other regulations are still there. It's really worth reading. Designing markets is a really difficult, challenging project of social engineering, and I think we just have to forthrightly face up to that reality. And by the way, Adam Smith, the great proponent of so-called free markets, what he really meant by that, free markets, free trade, is just anti-monopoly. He was totally, as I said before, it's a virtual quote. Whenever a regulation is in favor of the workers, it is always just and equitable. He thought labor market regulation was okay as long as it favored the workers. Thanks.
Before our reception, I'm going to give away a copy of Professor Anderson's The Imperative of Integration to a student who registered. Random selection in my hand. 0. Aberdeen Barry.
Try to get it now or later. Great, thank you very much.
I'll remind you that there's one more event on the Lynn Center's programming for the year, which is next Friday at 3 o'clock, Samuel Moyn from Yale University, Humane, the New Face of War. If you're interested in getting updates about events from across the Lynn Center, which I encourage because you might see things that are only from your nearby disciplines, but not see what, for example, is happening over in history or engineering if, like a lot of the people in this room, your center of gravity is on the political theory, political philosophy side. There are sign-up lists for the center-wide email list outside. I'd ask all Lynn Center affiliated faculty to join Professor Anderson and me up here immediately afterwards for a round of pictures, and I'd ask all RGCS associated students to colonize the side room behind the reception hall in about 10 minutes for a round of pictures there. And with that, we conclude this year's annual lecture. I invite you to join us for a reception in the room next door, and please join me in again thanking Professor Elizabeth Randall.